Hello, everyone. We're delighted to have you here this afternoon. We know how hard it is to get away from our desks at 4 o'clock, so we really appreciate that you've made your way here. We're extremely excited about the panel discussions that will be happening here today. We're going to be starting off with a panel about Chinese private museums. And then there will be a talk about the 450 years of exchange between Japan and the West. And the last will be a discussion on the effect of the lifting of the sanctions on export of culture from Iran. We expect there to be a lot of interesting themes going through the discussions, and also please ask a lot of questions. We'd love to hear them. And Vastari is delighted to be the organizer of this event. We work with collectors and museums worldwide, so we've really heard these issues being discussed firsthand and look forward to hearing what people have to say. So thank you very much for being here, and I'm passing you to Georgina Adam, who will be moderating the discussions.
Thank you so much. Well, I'm delighted to present this first panel, and we have a fantastic lineup. Those of you who got the invitation might have had different names. Unfortunately, I don't know what it is about private museums, but 2 people were actually taken ill. So we're particularly grateful to the people who stood in for them. And I'm going to start by introducing each panelist and asking them a question. So the introduction will come just before the question. They will give us a brief reply. The idea is to sort of set the scene for the discussion that will then continue on afterwards. So our first guest panelist is Catherine Giangrande, who is an art historian. She's at my far left. She's also an archaeological conservator. She's written widely. She's written books on museums and collecting. And particularly relevant to today are her 2 books, China Museums, and then the second volume, or the second edition, I would have said, sorry, not a volume, Chinese Museums Guide, Chinese Museums Association Guide, to get it right. She currently works for the Global Heritage Fund worldwide, but has particularly been working recently in Cambodia and Romania. So please give a warm welcome to Cathy. By the way, please, if you haven't done so, could you switch off your mobile phones? So the first question is, we'd like Cathy to set the scene a little bit about the scale of building of private museums in China today.
Okay, hello everyone. I first started going to China with my co-authors who worked on the books with me about 10 years ago. And we were always looking for the quirky and the offbeat museums. And those were really generally the private museums. And so we were really excited back in 2004 and 5 to find private museums sort of creeping out of the woodwork, because they really were museums that had collections that were hidden. During the Cultural Revolution, as you probably suspect, a lot of things were either destroyed or they had to be hidden away. And some of the most amazing collections were indeed hidden in people's rice containers and dug underground, and it's just incredible the stories we found out. Some of the most exciting ones we found include the ancient Chinese sex culture museum in Tongli. And people go, oh my God, it must be just filled with erotic art. Well, it was filled with erotic sort of representations, penises, dildos, whatever you, the whole range. But it also told you a lot about sort of sexual practices in China through history, including the eunuch culture, which is really important in China. Another museum which we really enjoyed going to, which again was a private museum, was an individual called Fanjin Xuan. He built in Sichuan an amazing museum cluster. He started with 10 museums. Today he has 26 museums. And they range from everything from 3-inch shoes to the Japanese war. And his idea is that he's trying to educate the Chinese public and the foreign public about what happened in China, the bad things, the future, the good things. And he's an incredible person. He has collected over 8 million objects, a lot of them related to the Cultural Revolution. But suddenly, a couple of years ago, there was like this incredible boom. It was almost like a surreal boom. And private museums just are popping up everywhere. And recently, I was with the Chinese Museum Association, who published the second guide. And they said in 2013, there were 4,165 museums registered. Out of that number, 865 are private. And 299 that year in 2013 were new. So that's almost one new museum a day. In 2014, the numbers are slowing down a bit. And they predict that there's going to be, well, this year there's about one every 3 days. But the fastest growing segment is definitely the private museum sector. And we just came back from China, and it's not only contemporary museums that we're seeing. We're seeing things like Jackie Chan. He's just opened the most incredible museum. It's like a Disney complex. It's not to everybody's taste, but you can film yourself in one of his movies. You can stand by famous characters from his movies. You can try various kung fu movements, and I've got some great pictures of myself doing that. But it's really the new rich, and well, Jackie Chan is rich too, both the Chinese and even some foreigners who are doing business in China, who are investing and building new museums. And I'm going to mention a few that we saw when we were there. We interviewed both curators, the directors, as well as the founders. There's the Hughes Museum in Shanghai, which recently opened, and that's Budi Tech, and he's a Chinese-Indonesian entrepreneur. And this is like this amazing airport hangar, which is filled with Chinese artists, contemporary works, but also international artists. And I think we'll probably touch upon that later, that there's a real mix now. It's not just Chinese art. There's the Long Museums by a billionaire duo, a husband and wife, and they have two museums, one contemporary and antiques combined, another one just sort of contemporary that's just opened. Then in Nanjing, which is another mind-blowing complex, the Sifang Art Museum, and it's a son and father who have opened this complex, and it's not, they call it a playground for the arts because it's not just about museums. In fact, there's only one museum at the moment. They have a structure for spa. There's another structure that's been built for conferences. They want to try to bring together all kinds of arts, not just fine art, but writers, poets, musicians, and they want to have a complex where you can interact with nature, so it becomes more than just a visit to a building. And that, they're spending like $164 million, and it's amazing. Hangzhou, we just announced that they're doing a similar thing. This is going to be a culture village where you can shop and see art at the same time. Another sort of theme that we're going to come across again, I think, in this conversation. Red Brick in Beijing, a very famous Chinese architect has done that, and that's a wonderful complex again. Contemporary property developer money, changing the galleries all the time. Aurora, another museum, an Ando-built museum which contains ancient and modern art again. So that just gives you a bit of a range.
Well, that's already an amazing overview. Our next speaker, you will hear from, we will be discussing afterwards. Our next speaker is Sylvia Chan. Do I pronounce that correctly? Xuan. Sorry about that, excuse me. Sylvia is artistic director at China Culture Connect, which is an organization that creates and organizes, founds and organizes UK-China cultural events. She was previously a coordinator at Chengdu Project. She's worked at Tate, and she was one of the team that took the Turner exhibition to China as part of its world tour. And she's also a lecturer at a number of museums in China, including Poli Museum and the Taipei Art Museum and the Shanghai Museum. So, Sylvia, we were talking a little bit earlier about the differences between Chinese museums and, what we know as a museum. Could you talk a little bit about that, please?
In China, we actually have two museum systems. One is fully funded by government, the public museum. Another one, just like Cassie mentioned, is the private museums, then a growing number of private museums and art galleries in China, mainly in the major city, in the east side of the country, like Beijing, Shanghai, Shenzhen, or even Nanjing. And government museums they are very different. I have to compare with UK, otherwise there will be too many. Government museum that, since the government say that, you need to open to public, the permanent display need to be free of charge for visitor to visit, and they become fully funded by government. But on the other hand, the appointment of their director will be appointed by government. So sometimes you will have a retired general from an army come to become the museum's director, or probably the secretary of the party in the museum. It's a very political position in the management level in a government museum. Whereas in a private museum, some of them are funded and built by collector, and the funder themselves will become the director. For instance, like the Long Museum or the Youth Museum in Shanghai, Wang Wei is the director of Long Museum, and then in the Yu Museum, Buddha is the director. Whereas, like for instance, like other private museum, for instance, OCAT, it's funded by the OCT group, and they already have a OCAT in Shenzhen, OCAT in Shanghai, and just opened in Xi'an. The director of the museum, they tend to appoint somebody from a professional background. For instance, like Carol Liu is the artistic director of the Shenzhen OCAT. The father of Chinese video art, Zhang Peili, is the artistic director of the Shanghai OCAT. And Karen Smith is the director of the newly opened OCAT in Xi'an. And the second differences between museum in the West and China are the censorship center. Yeah, government museums tend to be more conservative on what they exhibit. And even in government museum, they have like history museum and fine art museum. Most of the fine art museum, for instance, in the kind of a government culture minister level, is the NAMO, National Art Museum of China. And in provincial level, is, for instance, like Zhejiang Provincial Art Museum, Guangdong Museum of Art, in the past Shanghai Museum of Art, now it's called China Museum in Shanghai. And they have to, every year, some of the program will have to be almost nothing related to art, like the birthday of the party for how many anniversary. For instance, the successful of, for instance, like in China Museum in Shanghai, the success of the 20 years economy reformation, this kind of quite propaganda exhibition, almost nothing to do with art, will be held in a government-funded museum, whereas you will never find a conservative party's economy successful exhibition will held at the Tate or at the V&A. For contemporary art, I have to say that the private museum is more a knowledge house than the government museum. That is, you can't blame the government museum because until late 90s, a lot of the government museum, their function is only an exhibition organization. They functioned as a collection organization. It started from the 90s. I met a collector in Shanghai. It's very interesting. Since the 90s, he already collected all the award-winning work from the international art competition of Chinese printmakers. And at that time, even government museums don't realize that this collection is so valuable. He collected printmakers back to the 1950s in the Cultural Revolution period. And now even government museum want to have a retrospective exhibition of paintmaking in China, they have to borrow objects, even the woodblock from this collector. Yeah, but I'm sure that they will pick up very soon. For example, in 2009, when I worked for the Tate, we bring the Turner exhibition to National Art Museum of China. At that time, the museum still don't have a conservation department. We are a bit shocked that although a lot of forward planning, when the Turner collection arrived Namo, that a lot of the painting with frame couldn't go into the building because they actually give us an exhibition hall on the first floor, and the painting are too big to go into their lift, and the lift is not designed for huge paintings, and we had to bring it from the staircase. From ground floor to first floor, that some of the ceiling is too low. We have to break the whole ceiling to bring the painting to the first floor. And also we have to break the ceiling again when the exhibition finished. Yeah, that's true. Yeah, but in the past 2 years, I give a lot of lecture in Namo. They are actually with a lot of government fund. It's building the conservation center, and they are very ambitious. They want to become they want to build a conservation center for fine art for the whole Beijing area. Yeah, so I'm sure that they will get in touch with a lot of museums, send people for training, or maybe invite expertise from UK, from America, or from the rest of the Europe to help them very soon. Yeah.
Fascinating. So our third speaker is Laurie Luo. Laura. She is managing director of Art Find, which you founded, I think, yes, which is an art consultancy. Her background includes stints at Christie's, at Hua Gallery, and at the Art newspaper. She was educated at LSE and at Peking or Beijing University. She's fluent in Mandarin and English. And the question I'd like to ask you is, what influence are these museums having on how much are they tastemakers in China?
Right. Yeah, before I answer these questions, actually I'm recently involved in a project with RA, Royal Academy of Art, about the workshop we are going to host in China and Hong Kong about the art handling and conservation. So I'm sure that, like Zhang Xuhua mentioned, there is a huge demand for Chinese museums, especially private museums, to learn about the experience from the their Western competitors, basically. So back to my question. I think really the answer would be depends on how we define the taste. As to the taste of private collectors and the richest Chinese people, I think the private museums are really something serves a function for them to showcasing their taste instead of changing their taste. But I have observed the fact that over the past 5 years, I would say the trend of their taste is gradually shifting from ancient modern art to contemporary art, and shifting from Chinese art, the culture that they are very familiar with, to Western art. Although this process takes a long time, however, and you can see that from the collections that in many new museums, including the long museums that Kathy just mentioned, the one-way travel to Dubai to various international art fairs to buy very international artworks, as well as the Hao Museum, which is going to open next year in Shanghai. The owner, Zheng Hao, has the largest Damien Hirst collection in Asia. And there's another museum just opened in 79A Zone, It's called M. Woods Museum, and it's basically owned by a very young Chinese man from an important business family. He's only 27 years old, but his collection not just including some important Chinese artists like Xu Zhen, but also Tracy Amy, etc., etc. And you can see that those people's tastes are much more international, and they are much more open-minded as well. And secondly, as to the public taste, I think it's a little bit too early to say it's a little bit too early to see whether those museums have already changed the taste. Because as we all know, that the numbers of visitors of these private museums has always been a problem and issue. Those people, those founders of museums, they paid sky-high cost, running cost every year. Like Long Museum was like £1 million, about £1 million for running the museum. However, the visitors number is still not very, still being an issue. However, you can see they put a lot of efforts on delivering educational program. Excellent example will be Yulin Center, who has done excellent job in the past maybe half decade, as well as Long Museum. They started the educational program for the family, for adults and children, and they have a membership scheme, etc., etc. I would say those private museums, they have already bring more art to China, and the point I wanted to make it here is they bring more contact of the contemporary and Western art to Chinese public. This is a dimension that the public museums have been unable to provide a lot. Yeah.
Do the public museums also have educational programs, or is it mainly the private? There are as well.
Yeah, there are.
So both.
To kind of comment on what you say, in 2009, when the Turner go to National Art Museum of China, on arrival, because Tay also sent couriers to them. On arrival, we found that actually they don't have professional art handler. We have to train their security guard to help us to bring all the Turner painting to the first floor's exhibition hall. And I'm sure they can join your program.
My program.
Yeah. And also in 2009, our curators from the Tay, who are expert of Turner, went to Beijing as a courier. But the museum don't even think that they could help organize some talk with the curator in Namo. Eventually, when we went to Beijing in, I think it's June 2009, there's someone from the Poly Museum, the Auction House Museum, and also to the Art Museum, come to the exhibition and the very last day and met us, and they said, why don't you give a talk in the Poly Museum and also the Today Art Museum? So the talk about Turner were not given in the museum host the exhibition. It's in other museums that nothing to do with this exhibition. And talking about the audience, the Turner exhibition has 250,000 visitors over 2 months. However, a lot of the other exhibitions, no matter how in a government museum or private museum, we call that they are opening party only exhibition. Yeah. So on the opening day, there are a lot of people.
And on the free day.
Yeah.
On the free day too, because a lot of the museums offer a free day. Mm-hmm. And when they offer a free day, they actually have a line. Some of them have to close down.
Yeah.
And ask people to come on another day, give them a free ticket on another day.
Yeah.
But it's because some of the costs of getting into these museums, the private ones, is quite astronomical for a Chinese person.
What do you call astronomic? How high?
Well, do you remember 8? No, more than that, 16. I'm trying to think, RMB.
Probably 16 or 20.
20 RMB.
How does that compare with, to revenues? It's
a lot.
It would be the equivalent of what, £20 here? So one of our big private, big expensive museums? Yeah.
Yes, I think so. Yes. Yeah.
People have kind of a modest income.
Yeah.
It's inaccessible.
That's
in
why the
fact.
3 day is so popular.
Right.
Yeah.
Could we explore a little bit this connection between some private museums and real estate projects?
I think
I don't know who
want
wants
to give another example about I think it also could be a good example to respond to your question. Is I think a lot of people here have heard about K11 Foundation.
Yes, I was thinking of that. Yes.
Yeah, and
they took the money.
Yeah, they took the money, and it's been put in a department store, but they managed to make the space that matched the standard that a museum would require. And obviously that cost a lot of money on insurance, on security, and lighting, and humidity, and everything. But still, they managed to spend money and make it happen. And I think a lot of rich Chinese people, they wanted to, they prize the art as intellectual growth on the property project, and which will definitely add value on their department store, for example. This is a case in Shanghai, and there's another similar case called Parkview Green in Beijing, which is a similar idea, a really beautiful building and with art hotel inside, as well as our museum and gallery space. Mm-hmm. So I think a lot of property developers are very keen with the idea to bring the value of their property.
And do they get some sort of advantage? Do they get cheaper rents?
Yes, they do. Like the Today Museum was built in an area where they actually did like almost a planning gain. If you put a museum up, we'll give you cheaper land so you can build your apartments and your other commercial. Yeah, and Booty Tech did too. Yeah.
And I know the Long Museum, because Long Museum has two branches in Shanghai. One is in Pudong, and another one is westbound. I think the westbound building was originally one of the buildings for the Shanghai Expo in 2010. The building was given to Long free of charge by Shanghai government. However, Long Museum paid the whole cost for the kind of redecoration to make the building can be used as a museum. I give another example of not very well known but very interesting case, also like a real estate project that built a museum inside. There is a property development in the west area, west. It's called Xisihuan. So in the west side of Beijing city in the Xiangshan area. So the area is already kind of very suburban area, and landscape is beautiful. However, you build a property, large scale property development there. At the beginning, nobody wanted to buy it. So the developer, I actually know him, Mr. Huang Xiaohua. He came to Europe and he see a lot of use art and culture to regenerate the area's project, and follow the footsteps of Zhang Baoquan. He also built culture center within the development. In the culture center, there's a small museum, about 3,000, 4,000 square meters of exhibition space, and buildings for artist residencies project. And then also theaters and cinemas and public squares that has open air cinemas. And it's a great success. Although the exhibition are mainly support young artists come to artist residency program, but they later gain a lot of reputation. And because in the west area of Beijing city, there's no many art museums, that they were, the museum was awarded NGO status by the Beijing Wenhuaju. And that means that they are eligible to apply for government funding. And they do very interesting education projects. For instance, like they have educational project that ask artists who do residency there that design educational project for migrant workers' children. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Or children has autistic problem, autistic illness. Yeah, these are children that in the past that no any cultural organization will think can use art to help. And because of this kind of educational project, the museum will reward almost every year for equivalent to £300,000 of funding by the government just to run this project continually. And a month ago, when I visited Beijing, I went to meet their director. They told me that they were giving another project by Beijing government. It's also a property project in Yanjiao. It's like a satellite town of Beijing. That is a big IT industrial garden, which they couldn't bring business in. So they give this project for the developer, asked him if you could build a culture center there, and also maybe some residential and also office and kind of IT and high technology building for this kind of creative company. That would be great. They actually already accept the project. Yeah, why they were giving this kind of project? Because the government believe that they can bring in business, they can run the project very well through art and culture programs. Yeah.
I want to pass over to questions, so I'm just going to give one more topic and then we'll pass to the audience's questions. I'd like you just, perhaps starting with Kathy, just to explore slightly the problem of censorship, what is and what can be shown on particularly contemporary art. I've just come back from Paris, where Paul McCarthy was all over the news with his Christmas tree. Yeah. Kathy.
That was a topic that we were really interested in exploring on our recent sort of survey of these contemporary museums. And we spoke with, again, the directors and the curators. And the same response came, that actually there is censorship. Things do have to pass through the government, but the private museums actually have a little bit of an edge over, I think, the government museums, in that they are allowed to sort of sometimes sneak things in that aren't, in a subtle way sometimes, that aren't so obvious. And they also said that some of the people that come to review the collections and to review the art aren't that knowledgeable. So sometimes they don't get the subtleties of what's being displayed. For what reasons?
Do the private museums, to an extent, allow the government to allow things to happen that they wouldn't to happen under their aegis? To an extent, is it a way of? Has that idea ever occurred to anyone?
I think it. Yes, yeah. I think yes.
Yeah. For instance, like Ai Weiwei, I don't think in the past few years can show in any government art museums. However, it does show in the Yulen's Center for Contemporary Art. Yeah.
I would like to open to questions now, so if you'd like to put your hand up and to say who your question is directed to. Francesca. And please wait for the mic, as Francesca did.
I have two questions. Is that possible?
One maybe, because we don't have much time. The more important one.
Okay. So I was just wondering about all the underlying motivations of collectors when they open their private collections or the private museums, because obviously there is a reputation side that all private collectors have when they open new museums. But as you say that they have a very high price to enter and so on, I wonder if there is other motivations, maybe like a business idea behind it. Maybe if you can expand on that.
So, yes, the motivations for the private collectors opening museums.
Well, go ahead.
Perhaps Rio?
Well, from my perspective, I think there are two reasons. And like a lot of famous American families like Gettys, Rockefellers, and they made their name in our history by founding the museums. I think this is a similar way that the Chinese rich family wanted to do as well. And I think the second reason is that because a lot of government now, I mean local government, and is really fancy the idea of having the cultural center in part of the property development. So this will enhance or beneficial to the collectors and the rich people to get the permission from the land. So I think this is the two main reasons. Yeah.
But I think also a big issue for all of them that we spoke to was education. They were there for a purpose, and their purpose was to try to educate the public, both foreign public in Chinese contemporary work and the Chinese themselves.
behind the tickets and the price, the very high price? Is just for, just to maintain the place, or is there?
Yes, I mean, they don't have in place as many, like they do have Friends programs which are starting, membership programs which are starting, but they're not bringing in the kind of money they need to maintain these huge, huge buildings.
Yes, I think in a government museum that nowadays most of them are free of charge. Even special exhibitions still free of charge. And then I think because in here, that develop an exhibition is a very mature idea. That the exhibition, for instance, like the main exhibition at the British Museum itself is a product that carefully built with 3-4 years research into it. And then also for an exhibition that ticket sale, how many income will bring in by ticket sale, will bring in by publication, will bring in by the gift shop, and also bring in by the audience come to the museum and stay longer, maybe use the canteen and buy more gifts. It is the whole business. And also even that the cost of an exhibition would mainly on like transportation of the hour, a loan fee from other collectors, and they have a whole research of, for instance, like the main exhibition, if we need to borrow 100 objects from Beijing, how much it will cost, then we borrow maybe just 50 objects from Beijing, 50 objects from other organizations within the UK. I'm sure the cost in the second one will be much lesser than the first one. So it is a very mature system in Western Museum. However, in Chinese Museum, I think they're still learning it. For instance, like Buddha Yu, he just think that he don't want to show other people's exhibition. He only want to show and research his own collection. But think about, for instance, like I know for instance, if he has Tracey Emin's hour in his museum, but he can't have everything. He might have to cooperate with other organizations. Also has important Tracey Emin's work, pieces. But I think it will take time for them to understand. This process of collaboration actually is good for the organization and good for them making the program, because other people will bring in ready-made resources. It will help to make the program better, promote the program better.
I think that it's still a system in transition.
Yes.
I think I would love to have you here for another hour at least. Unfortunately, I have had a signal. I'm afraid we have to bring this panel to an end. I hope that within this short time, we've nevertheless been able to explore some of the aspects, and I'd like you to thank very much our speakers. I would also like to say that Sylvia has actually prepared a written document, and if anybody would like to receive it, if they could get in touch with the organizers, I'm sure she would be happy to share it with you. Thank you so much. Okay. Our next panel is going to be in a different form because it's going to be in the form of 3 presentations, so it's not a discussion, but there will still be time at the end to ask a question or two. The subject is mutual vision, 400 years of artistic exchange between Japan and the West. So our first speaker is going to be Marta Olszewska, who's an art historian and also a specialist of Japanese art. She's head of business development at Asia, business development in Asia at Vastari, and she's a valuer of Japanese works of art. And she has worked in the past as well for Asian art dealers such as Michael Goodhouse and Greg Baker. So let's welcome Marta.
Yes, so the subject of mutual vision brings us back to the important celebrations of 400 years of exchange of contacts between Japan and the West. So the 3 of us will discuss how those relations translate into art, how the Japanese people saw the foreigners, how we looked at the Japanese people, And Paul will finish with how the contemporary Japanese see themselves. I am going to cover the first and the longest chunk of that 400-year period, from about 1550s until around 1800. So there's a lot to squeeze into 10 minutes, but I'll try my best. So yes, the first ever Europeans to ever come to Japan were the ubiquitous merchants, Portuguese merchants, who were soon followed over the 1550s by merchants of other nationalities and missionaries, mainly Jesuits, who were converting first Japanese people, building churches, and all that gave rise to a movement we know as Nanban art, which literally means art of southern barbarians, which sounds a little bit politically incorrect if you ask me, but anyway. So that existed for about 100 years, and then, unfortunately, the Japanese government imposed a policy called sakkoku, which literally means locked country. All the missionaries were expelled out of Japan, and anyone trying to enter the country would be executed. So that severely limited the number of foreigners the Japanese people could interact with. And the foreigners were only allowed in Japan in a few designated areas, like offshore islands or a few selected ports. So the official relations with outside world were not established until 1880s, following so-called Meiji Revolution, which I think Alexandra will mention later on. So I will show a few visual examples, my favorite part, in a chronological order, and you will notice a certain trend. As I was preparing for this talk, I thought the Western examples often westernized their Japanese subject, so as if the artists were saying, obviously, they look Western because everyone wants to look Western. This is the best way to look. And in the Japanese examples, you will notice that it's almost as if the artists were emphasizing how odd and quirky and different the foreigners look. So both, of course, attitudes show equal amount of prejudice, but we have to remember that, especially back then, the images are political. So the form of the image was influenced by the purpose of creating it. But without any further ado, I will move on to the examples. So these are the officially known first Japanese people to ever to travel to the West. It was a mission sent in 1582. It wasn't by any means an official mission, but that's what it came to be viewed as later on in the history. It was a group of 4 teenage boys, around 14. They were selected from aristocratic families and sent to Europe by Alessandro Vagliano, who was the head of the Jesuit mission in Asia. They were meant to see the Pope pay their allegiance to him as their pastor, because they were baptized, prove that Japan actually exists. It's not a legendary land somewhere out there, and hopefully gain some additional funds for the understaffed mission in Japan, and then go back to their country and relate the glory of the Western world to their countrymen. As you see, nothing in that image actually, except for the description above, says that could give us a hint that they are actually Asian. The attire, the faces, the hairstyle, it's all Western. It's a fascinating story, this mission, by the way. So here we're moving on to the Japanese side. So the first Europeans in Japan, the Portuguese merchants, and it instantly shows how different they are. They're an alien body in the Japanese ecosystem. They wear these funny clothes, they have huge noses, and they use strange equipment, something that looks like Chinese chairs, if you ask me, and those tall pots, I imagine that's coffee, so beverage unknown to the Japanese. And I don't know whether this mix is conscious or not, but again, to emphasize that they are actually not locals. And moving on, my favorite one, the portrait of Hasekura Tsunenaga. This is actually the image that inspired me to propose this subject for the evening. He was a head of a mission, a subsequent mission sent to Europe by a wealthy feudal landlord, Date Masamune. The mission had two goals. He was supposed to speak to the Spanish king for permissions to trade with Mexico and ask the Pope for more missionaries to be sent to Japan. So I imagine that together with those missionaries, the landlord was hoping that the Western knowledge would come to his domain, especially in the terms of in the area of Western militaria. And so he was sent in 1615, and even though he and his entourage must have seemed like messengers from some sort of remote, exotic, and back then really insignificant country, I think both the king and the Pope saw a really good piece of PR for themselves, and he was greeted with all the possible honors in Spain. He was baptized as Felipe Francisco Hasekura. In Rome, he was instantly given the honorary citizenship of Rome and paraded on the top of a fine steed to the audience with the Holy Father. And this is when the portrait was commissioned in 1615. And I actually saw it in the Tokyo National Museum earlier this year, and it was quite a personal experience because it was my first time in Japan, coming from Europe, and I felt a bit lost sometimes, and I just looked at him and I thought, Hasekura-san, you understand, you know what it's like to stick out like sore thumb and be completely out of context. So at the same time, it just dawned on me, you look so Western, why? Why is this? It's just this clothes that looks out of place. And surely this couldn't have been due to the artist's lack of skill, so I thought, why? And it dawned on me, maybe it was a way for the artist to say, welcome to the club, welcome to the baptized Christian civilized club. And yes, this portrait is a really fine example of a 17th century court portraiture. It has all the components, so the crest of the sitter, the dog, symbol of loyalty at his feet. It's also loaded with heavy Christian symbolism, the figures in the sky. It doesn't really fall too far away from other fine examples of fine portraiture of the period. This is a Polish aristocrat painted by an Italian artist. I even like the way their coats match. It's quite interesting. So moving on to another image of the same person. So Hasekura's westernization goes one step ahead. He's even wearing Western clothes. The only hints that we have here that he's actually Asian could possibly be his sword sticking out from under his coat, his hairstyle, maybe the eyes, but otherwise he could get away as a conquistador, I think. Unfortunately, his mission was not successful, and the Sakkoku policy was imposed. So foreigners became even more of a curiosity. And the next example, the small carving, an etsuke, of a Dutchman is probably seen as that type of curiosity, something funny, odd, something you would show off to your friends. So poor Dutchman, but that's what he ended up as. We move on to a screen showing a group of merchants in a port, and on the left-hand side, there's a family of a Dutch merchant. As we zoom in, we see those massive blue eyes and white pale face. He almost looks like a zombie, and it's quite scary. If we look at his wife and the nanny of his boy, they look like ghosts. But what actually jumped at me when looking at this image is the shy use of shading, the chiaroscuro. Especially, I'm not sure if it's visible, part of skirts. You can see that this anonymous artist depicting foreigners maybe allowed himself to flirt with a foreign technique. He wouldn't normally do that. It doesn't happen in the traditional Japanese art. And I actually found a very good quote by a Jesuit, again, who went to Japan in around 1600s. Father, I imagine, Father João Rodrigues. So what he says is, you will laugh, but they know very little about painting the human body and its various parts, and they can hardly be compared with our painters as regards to the portrayal of the body itself and the proportion of its members. They lack the true knowledge of shading figures, for this is what makes the figures stand out and gives them strength and beauty. And I think it says a lot about the cultural misunderstandings that we've been discussing, but I feel like it's still something that's foreign, that's different than us, doesn't fail to fascinate. So on that positive note, I would like to pass everyone on to Alexandra, please.
So thank you so much. So Alexander Gerlich is a curator at the Manga Museum of Japanese Art and Technology, and I have to say that I had to ask what it was. It is actually in Krakow in Poland, and it contains a collection, a very large collection, built up in the 19th century by a Polish collector of manga. Yes.
Felix Jasiński manga.
Yeah. Alexandra contributed to the catalogue of the exhibition Japan Facing West, which looked at artistic contacts between Japan and the outside world during what was supposedly the closed Edo period. So I'll pass to Alexandra.
Right. Thank you very much. I will talk about another milestone in the history of Japan, which was its opening for foreign cultures in the second half of 19th century. It began with opening the boards in 1854, when the black ships, famous black ships, threatened the Uraga harbor. The first official contacts were followed by the economic and later by cultural exchange. And one of the most important events in this moment, in this process, was the World Fair in Paris in 1867, where the Japanese exposition was presented. In that time, in that moment, the phenomenon called Japanism, which was the biggest cultural exchange between Japan and the West, began. But what can be exchanged if two parts don't know each other? What is the each other portrait? A moment of the first sight is of people from the other country is always time of careful watch, a time of creating stereotypes, and the stereotypes are placeholders of the knowledge, which is lack of knowledge in the beginning always. The first people see the physiognomy, the faces, hair, noses, legs, hands, all these physiognomy elements. Then the costume, which is completely different in the West and in Japan. And finally, different behaviors of the basic elements of our life, such as waving, smiling, even sneezing or eating. So in the end of 19th century, for the first time, the economic and cultural exchange was so wide-ranged. The ordinary people from Japan and ordinary people from the West, Europe and America, meet each other. They saw each other's cultural attributes, daily things. And one of the main factors were world fairs, such as those in Paris, in Vienna, or Chicago. But the other were Japanese studying and trading abroad. And this is how the stereotypes were creating. Let me show you a few examples of Japanese Yokohama pictures, which illustrate various Western nations in a way which is nowadays make us laughing or feel abusing. So at first we look at Englishmen, and at first sight what we can see? We can think that all the Englishmen wear uniforms, and they are probably soldiers. If they're not soldiers, they have big dogs, and ladies wear a huge overcoating dress, which is not typical for Japanese, actually. Later on, Russians were always depicted with instrument or during dance or in colorful, very interesting costumes. Interesting either for Japanese but also for other Western nations. Then French lady on the horseback and the proud, serious American merchant, also with big dog. And here is the picture I would like to point out, the pose of the lady. This is pose taken directly from the beginning of 19th century paintings by Jacques-Louis David or Proudhon or someone from that moment. Actually, it was already the mode in Western paintings, but for Japanese, that was very Western, something modern, brand new, actually. And on the other hand, we can see European and American painters who tried to present Japan as it is. They were people who were traveling to Japan. They were diplomats or merchants or artists making traveling for their inspiration. And here we have a Karel Fürth, Polish painter, picture from the 1920. He was a diplomat then in a diplomatic mission in Japan. And as we can see, he tried to present as many Japanese artifacts as possible in one picture. So we have furniture, we have Japanese women in kimono preparing tea, if I see well. And of course, must be folding screen, must be scroll, must be painting and lampions, whatever you want. Everything is in here. The next one are two portraits by George Henry from the Glasgow School. And if I can say something about the stereotypes, this is Madame Butterfly. He painted many portraits of Madame Butterfly in his life. Always in beautiful kimono, always with such blur, and with these umbrellas. And in the end, James Tissot with portrait of Tokugawa Akitake, who was actually the last head of the Tokugawa clan from Mito domain. And he was traveling to Europe in 1867. And during that time, Tissot was his drawing teacher. But here we can see portrait of Japanese representative of aristocracy, painted by a European painter in Japanese style with Japanese style signature, but on the other hand, it's with watercolor. So it's a maximum mixed style painting. It's, I think, later mounted by as a scroll in a Japanese way. So, summing up, the first impression which can be taken from Yokohama is that the Western people are tall, messy, red or fair-haired. Men are bearded and wear uniforms. Women wear huge dresses with hats. While if we follow Western vision of Japan, where she suggested that the population of this country consists only of geishas and samurai class representatives, not much else, actually. My hope is that the stereotypes are usually followed by the knowledge. So I believe that already it happened between West and East. And we're in this place where we know each other much better, and we can look at these pictures only as just for fun, as with sentimental look. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. So to come completely up to date now, we have, as our last speaker on this session, is Paul Binney. He's a Japanese woodblock print artist and also a collector of Japanese art. He spent 6 years in Japan learning about woodblock prints, and he still travels to Japan regularly. His prints and paintings are exhibited worldwide. He has 2 galleries, Shoten Japanese in New York and Saru in the Netherlands. He exhibits with galleries and dealers who specialize in Japanese prints. So, Paul.
Thank you very much. I'm quite pleased that Alexandra showed us some examples of Yokohama-e, because my first 2 illustrations are of this same field. This is a print from about 1860. Most of them are from this date. They're from the early period of the 1860s. This one's by an artist called Utagawa Sadahide. It's South American and Portuguese and English and French pentaptic, so there are 5 sheets in the entire design. This is one particular sheet showing a woman. I think this is a South American one. For me, this is the Japanese looking at something exotic, something that was entirely outside of their own experience at that time. Previously, as Alexandra has said, and we've talked about before, Japan was closed to the outside influences of Europe and the United States. In the 1850s, Japan was forced to open, and suddenly a rush of influences from the West were able to come into the country. Foreigners were seen by Japanese artists, but at a certain remove. And Japanese artists weren't particularly close to them, and so would perhaps observe them on the streets or could see them in public, but were perhaps not very familiar with foreigners. So, in fact, I've chosen one illustration the same as Alexandra had. This one is the English couple with their dog. I imagine, since they're wearing outdoor clothes, they were spotted on a street in Yokohama. This is by the artist Yoshikazu. And he's noted very carefully that the woman's she's carrying a print of foreigners. The foreigners themselves wanted to collect these prints of foreigners because they found them quite amusing, as we still do today. The Japanese view of the foreigners was that they were exotic and unusual and completely different to the Japanese. And my point in my talk is to talk about how that system has entirely changed from the 1860s until the contemporary world. The depiction that we see at this period is largely a depiction by an artist who has been looking only at ukiyo-e. And ukiyo-e was the style of printmaking and painting, in fact, that was popular during the period from the 17th through to the mid-19th century. It was a period of stylization and simplification. Forms were shown without shading. People were shown in a very simplified way. The line was the basic element of a drawing, and it was filled in with color. If we look at the costume of the woman, particularly, the artist has tried to give a three-dimensional feel to it by using shading in the folds of her costume. And this is largely influenced by looking at Western models. So that not only the subject, but also the technique of portraying these people is, to an extent, an exotic technique. It's a different technique for a Japanese artist. I'm going to slip forward about 40 years in period to the Meiji period. This is the period when Japan had now fully opened to Western culture. This print is by an artist called Tomioka Eisa, and it dates from roughly about 1890 or 1900. And it's Kuchie, which is the opening illustration in a novel, a popular novel of the period. I've been unable to find the source of this, but I think the image itself is quite interesting. Because on the left, we have very obviously a Japanese woman, entirely in Western clothing of the late 19th century, turn of the century. And on the right, there's a Western man. We can tell he's Western because he's got big nose and blonde hair. And all Westerners have big noses and blonde hair. It's the same as the stereotypes that Alexandra was talking about that go back to the Yokohama-e. If you're depicting a foreigner, you make him very foreign. You give him blonde hair and a big nose. So I'm not quite sure what's happening here because I don't know the novel. But it seems to me he's rummaging for clothes in a trunk, or I'm not sure. Anyway, for me, the basic point of this image is putting together a Japanese woman in Western clothes with a foreigner in some strange, mysterious way. It's quite fun. We're going to flip forward again in time to this image. This is a portrait of the artist Elizabeth Keith, who was a Scottish-born woodblock printmaking artist working in Tokyo in the 1920s. And it was painted by one of the great artists of female beauty prints of the 1920s and 30s called Ito Shinsui. And this one dates to 1922. And this, I think, is a step forward, but also a slight look back in the depictions of foreigners by Japanese artists. Miss Keith obviously did have red hair, which you can see just underneath her hat, but also she's got lots and lots of orange feathers on the hat that make it look as though she's got some mad hairstyle. She does also have blue shadow on her face. Now, this is quite odd because in Japanese prints in general, women are shown without shading on the face. They tend to have a completely flat white or pale pink skin tone with no shading, and the outlines are drawn to delineate the features. But in this, Elizabeth Keith has got pink on the cheeks and quite noticeable blue around the chin and shading under the eyes. So Shinsui is moving away from very traditionally typical Japanese printmaking and being very strongly influenced by Western art. So not only is he using a Western model, but he's using Western forms of printmaking. It's interesting to me, too, that she's sitting on a zabuton, which is a Japanese floor cushion, rather than sitting in a chair. Although she's entirely dressed in Western clothes and keeping on her hat indoors, she's sitting on a floor cushion, which seems a very 20s sort of thing to do. Strange. Quite a different image from close period is this one by an artist called Kobayakawa Kiyoshi. It's from about 1930, and this is a detail. I had to slightly crop this image, but the title of the print is Tipsy. And now this is a Japanese girl, obviously, and she has in front of her a martini, and she's smoking a cigarette, and her eyes are shaded slightly greenish. So we can assume that perhaps this isn't the first martini of the evening. She's also wearing her hair cut short. Now, this is 1930, and of course, lots of women in the West cut their hair short, but Japanese women were doing it too. And this is an aspect that we sometimes may forget, that Japan was moving along just as other Western countries were. Japan had access to magazines and to Western films. They had access to fashion plates and to illustrations of what was currently popular. And so there were as many people following Western fashions as there were still sticking to traditional kimono and traditional hairstyles in Japan. In fact, in the 1930s, it was quite usual to see a mix of both on the streets of big cities. You would see women in Western clothing and women in kimono. By this period, most men had started to wear Western clothing pretty much all the time. They would occasionally wear kimono at home, for example, but would almost always be wearing Western clothing. So this girl, although there might be seen to be a slight criticism by the artist of the fact that she's had perhaps a little bit too much to drink, she is quite a typical girl, not only of Japan, but perhaps of the whole of the westernized world. This is an artist called Enomoto Chikatoshi, who was a painter, again, of beautiful women. And this painting, a female skier, is actually on a screen. It's a screen painting. I've had to slightly crop it. It's a 2-panel screen of the girl skiing. And this to me shows that by this period, again, this is the late 30s, Japanese people were as westernized as people in Western countries. There's very little apart from her face that would give away the fact that she is Japanese. If she was turned away, I assume that we'd imagine that she was perhaps skiing in the Alps or skiing in somewhere in the west of the Rocky Mountains or something. She could easily be a Western skier. The face gives her away, but nothing else. By this period, the late 30s, Japan had colonial intentions in lots of places within Asia and in the Southern Pacific. It was following the example set by most of the Western countries of Europe who had grabbed land and colonies elsewhere. And of course, this was eventually what brought Japan into the Second World War, its need to keep its colonies and so on. Japan had followed the lead of the West to the extent that politics and social life had become as Western countries. We flip on now past the war into the 1960s. Again, we've gone back to the artist Ito Shinsui. And again, I've taken an example of a woman in Western dress. But I think here there's very little to tell you that she's Japanese anymore. Perhaps slightly around the eyes, but then perhaps not. It's very difficult to say that she's even got a feeling of Japan about her now. So Japan has now moved entirely into an international forum rather than being still a uniquely Japanese place. And from there, we move on to this image. This is a cell from an animation from a 1990s television show called Slam Dunk, which was produced by Toei Animation from 1993 to 1996. To me, this is no longer a Japanese face. He could be mixed race, he could be Latino, he could be lots of different things, but that, to me, has no feeling of Japan. However, the character within the television show is Japanese. His nickname is Gorilla, but nonetheless, he is Japanese. And the show itself, being called Slam Dunk, is about basketball, rather. So it's a sports-related animation. And finally, just to show Japan has really moved completely into being an international country, this is a character from an animation called Bishoujo Senshi Sailor Moon, or Pretty Guardian Sailor Moon, from 1992 to 1997. It was created by an artist called Takeuchi Naoko. This character is Japanese. Her name is Moon Rabbit, but nonetheless she is Japanese, and she has blue eyes and blonde hair. So my point is that at this point, the Japanese are as Western as any other Western country. There's complete assimilation in the way that the Japanese see themselves and represent themselves in popular arts. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. We have a little time for questions. Are there any questions in the room? I would like to just ask, because Takashi Murakami also portrays, but actually your conclusion, which is that Japanese have totally moved into the Western. As a foreigner in Japan, do you feel that?
I think when you are a foreigner in Japan, you still feel very much outside. But nonetheless, I think the Japanese see themselves very much as belonging to the club of westernized countries. I mean, economically and socially, Japan is as Western as any other country. And although I think, yes, you're quite right, when you're a foreigner and you're traveling around Japan, you definitely feel very other. I think that the Japanese view themselves very much as a part of the whole, rather than as being very different.
I think it's something that always strikes foreigners, is that the manga do have these very westernized faces. But if you don't look at manga, if you look, say, at an illustration in a book, would you also see such westernized faces?
Well, I think perhaps manga emphasize it more than other places, and I think there's a similarity between the depictions that you see in manga, and the similarity goes back through ukiyo-e to prints of the 18th and 19th centuries. perhaps book illustrations and magazine illustrations are a little different, but this is also because photography has taken over a lot, and books and magazines tend to be illustrated with photographs rather than with drawings and paintings nowadays. So the artist's view is much less prominent, perhaps. But, yeah.
Are there any other questions in the room? Could you wait for the microphone, please? Right here.
Hi. I am really not very familiar with Japanese culture, so that was a very interesting talk. I was just wondering if, in general, Japanese artists, they seem to be, like as we've seen, really westernized and very much impacted by Western features, but are they also interested in preserving their own identity and in also kind of promoting it?
Well, I would say that there are aspects of their own culture that some artists are very keen on continuing, but most Japanese artists today view themselves in an international context and that they work in international media much more so than traditional Japanese media. That historically, Japanese artists worked in water-based pigments or in print, for example, but nowadays most artists are working in digital media or installation or oil painting if they're a little bit old-fashioned. But they're not so interested in traditional Japanese media. And I think the formats have changed and also their views have changed to be much more international nowadays.
I'm not sure if you're familiar with the super flat movement, which is kind of cartoonish and very manga-ish, if I can use that expression. It's horrible, I'm sorry. But it has nothing to do with traditional Japanese art, but at the same time, it is very Japanese, because manga, as such, is very Japanese, isn't it? I'm not sure if it's confusing more or answering the question.
Thanks very much. One more question. Okay.
I have a question.
Yes, great.
Why did they close off from the rest of the world in the
1633. I was wondering as well, because they rejected all the missionaries and Christian faith. It was kind of merging the two, the foreigners and that new faith, the new religion. And Japanese are normally very open to new religions, so that kind of is illogical. But I think it was more of a fear of being colonized, and basically the whole Christian story was just an excuse to say thank you. But
maybe the way the missionaries were behaving was too offended, too active.
And in order to survive, they were indulging in trade as well. And,
yes.
and there were different sorts of missionaries who were causing trouble between each other. That was another reason.
I think there was also the problem that the missionaries demanded a loyalty to the Pope in Rome, which conflicted with loyalty to the shogunate. And it's difficult for a Japanese samurai to have two masters. And so you couldn't be both loyal to the Pope and loyal to your master. So I think that was another contributing factor, maybe.
Well, thank you so much. That was a wonderfully interesting talk. And I'm sure that you'll want to thank our speakers very much. So welcome back. I know you didn't go anywhere, to our third and final session, which is about the lifting of sanctions in Iran. We've got three very good speakers. We're going to start with Janet Rady, who's a specialist of Middle Eastern contemporary art at the Auction Room, which was founded about 2 years ago now. And she's also director of Janet Rady Fine Art. She has a master's degree in Islamic art history from the University of Melbourne and a BA from the School of Oriental and African Studies. Actually, I should have had that round the other way, shouldn't I? Her experience includes working for Sotheby's and for Thomas Gibson. And Janet has just returned from assisting at a conference which was called the First Europe-Iran Forum. And so she's going to tell us briefly, before we move on to the discussion, the similar format to the first one. Each speaker will speak about a specific subject and then we'll move on to a general conversation. So Janet, tell us a little bit about what happened at this forum.
Well, the reason for the inaugural forum was because, as you may be aware, the UN Security Council are in discussions with Iran at the moment about the nuclear program, and there is in fact a deadline of the 24th of November this year by which a decision needs to be made. If it's not made, then the sanctions will stay as they are. If the decision and the agreement is reached, then there is the possibility of the lifting of the sanctions. So we are in a very important time at the moment whereby the whole situation with doing business with Iran, we hope, will change, although even if the sanctions are lifted, it was made very clear at the conference that things are not going to change overnight. So it may well be, for instance, a couple of years before, and I'm sure Daniel will be talking more about it, the financial sanctions with Iran are lifted. Now, what does this mean on a practical level? Well, in fact, there are no sanctions at the moment in dealing with the export of works of art, and I'm talking about contemporary works of art from Iran into the UK. It's perfectly legal. There would be no reason why you cannot, as an individual, import a contemporary work of art from Iran, either directly from the artist or from a gallery in Iran. And in fact, there are many examples of this. There are many galleries in London who do hold exhibitions of contemporary art coming directly from Iran. There are collectors who are buying works of art from Iran. Obviously, they are subject to all of the import regulations which any work of art coming from outside the EU is subject to. In other words, the payment of the 5% import VAT or bringing the work into bond. So that's really the good news. The main issue, and again, I'm going to leave this to Daniel, is the financial sanctions, because it is prohibited in many instances to actually make payments to anybody in Iran, and it's also very difficult for people in Iran to make payments out of Iran to the UK. Now, obviously, the galleries, the private clients who are acquiring the works of art do have ways and means of dealing with it. Some of them perhaps legal, some of them possibly less legal, but that, I would say, is the main issue at the moment, which is restricting any of the business. Unfortunately, it's very, very misunderstood. I come across cases all the time when I'm told, how can I be dealing with Iran? The banks don't like opening up bank accounts for people who are doing business in Iran because they misunderstand the fact, and when I'm talking about doing business, I'm talking about specifically the art trade. They misunderstand that there is no sanctions for doing the actual business. They're confusing that with the financial sanctions. So it's not easy. There are various bodies which you can turn to, such as the British Iranian Chamber of Commerce, and they will give you guidance. They may need to refer you to a lawyer, or you can talk to, again, Daniel, the HM Treasury, about actually making the financial transaction. But just to sum it up, in terms of the actual business of bringing in the works of art, that's absolutely fine. If anybody has questions, I'm very happy to answer them. I haven't touched on the issue of censorship. That's a different matter, but maybe that will come up in the discussions. So, let's come on to that
later. Thank you, Janet. So our next speaker is actually a practicing artist, Suhaila Sokhanvari. She graduated from Chelsea in 2006, has an MFA Fine Art from Goldsmiths College in 2011, and has many prizes. One of the top 7 new graduates for Extract at GL Strand in Copenhagen in 2011. She's currently a resident artist at the Wysing Arts Centre, Cambridge, and has exhibited widely, internationally and nationally, and is shortlisted for the Global Art Affairs Foundation exhibition for next year's Venice Biennale. So Suhaila asked me to say specifically, she's come back just recently, 10 days ago, from a trip to Iran, and her comments are not just for her personally. She would like to reflect the voices of artists in Iran today.
just wanted to say thank you for inviting me today and allowing me today to be the voice of Iranian artists in Iran. Just to say, I wasn't in Iran. I spoke to Iranian artists sorry. I was last in Iran in 2009. But yeah, I did speak to Iranian artists on the phone and on Facebook and emailing. So all these points that I'm raising today are directly from Iranian artists concerned regarding sanctions. So first of all, I'm actually focusing on visual art. And of course, the scenario is slightly different if you're a writer, actor, or a musician. So the one thing that was common amongst most of these artists concerned was the price of art material. Most of the major art shops, are in Tehran. So if you don't have access to Tehran, to get access to art material is really difficult. And these shops don't have a very good range of art material, or the art materials are sort of like limited in number or in cost. And so a lot of artists, if they want to buy quality material, they have to go to neighboring countries like Turkey or Dubai. And you can't carry art material like oil paints in your whole luggage. So it's quite difficult to buy art material. So the imported art material is 4 to 10 times the price of what they would be here. I have to say at this stage that, just to give you a sense of monetary power in Iran, a teacher in Iran earns between £200 to £300 a month, and then a professor in a university earns between £800 to £1,000 a month. So in 2007, a roll of black and white film, 24 film, is about £8. In 2008, it became £15, and after 2010, it was impossible to find. So in many shops, there's no refund and exchange policies. So as an artist, you can go to a shop and buy something, and I have done that as well in 2009, bought some acrylic paint, you take it home, it's dry, and because a lot of materials sit on the shelf, because people can't afford to buy them. So that it's not really the shopkeeper's fault either, because you feel sorry for them. They've got their back against the wall. They need to shift the material. So during the reign of the Pahlavi regime, Iran imported everything, even products that it was capable of producing itself. Since the revolution and introduction of sanctions, Iran, like many countries under similar situation, has learned to be a bit more self-sufficient. That means regarding art material, there's quite a lot of factories that are now producing its own art. So in the art shops, there's quite a lot of material being sold from Iranian art factories, Chinese, and then South Korean art products, with Iranian art material being the cheapest. Now, either due to sanctions against the raw material or lack of experience, the art material made by art factories in Iran are not as good. So if I can sort of explain to those of you who might not know what I mean. If you buy a really good art material in England, say Old Holland paint, it's based on a metal paint product. It's based on a metal salt, or your ultramarine will have lapis lazuli in it. Now, these are result in art material which are colors will be very vibrant, and they will be very sort of zingy, and they will be very dazzling in product. Your paint will become that. Whereas an art material that's made in Iran, it will become like a hue of something, because you can't get hold of the actual metal salt. So it ends up being less vibrant. So that can affect how a painting can look. So, you're kind of limited with the art material there. Since 2010, there has been over 200 galleries that have popped up in Tehran. So your most visibility is afforded to artists that live in Tehran or have access to Tehran. And if you come from smaller towns, then you're not as visible. And, it costs so much money to to exist or visit Tehran. One of several my own family and friends, and I'm from Shiraz. A lot of artists that I know come from Shiraz and Esfahan, and they were complaining basically regarding the price of airline or any kind of transport to Tehran, because everything happens obviously from Tehran. So one of their fear is the cost of things, but also they're really worried about getting on internal domestic flights, because there has been sanctions against aeroplane parts, and so, as you know, there has been tragedies. And one of the artists that I talked to regarding this, one of her family members was involved in the 2009, I think, accident in Caspian airline that crashed outside Armenia. So, these are real concerns that's, about the practicality of existing in Iran. Iranian collectors have limited access to auction houses and purchase possibilities abroad. So they now turn their attention to domestic market, which could be good on one level if you are an artist that has gallery representation, or if you have an agent or a patron, or some kind of access to private money, you come from a wealthy background. But not so if you don't have those, because what you end up with a very strange, closed domestic market, which becomes a buyer's market. And no closed market is a democratic one or a good one. So with this closed market, what happens is the collectors end up somehow, if you don't have protection, so I have to say, if you don't have an agent, if you're an artist and you're trying to survive on your own, in this closed market, what you have is you're back against the wall, because the collectors can bring your price down, and there's quite a lot of collectors that buy art from Iranian artists and they sell it outside, abroad, anywhere, Dubai, Abu Dhabi, whatever, and they make money from that system. So what the artists in Iran are really complaining about is the fact that you can't exist as an artist unless you either come from a family who can afford for you to become an artist, and as I said, it costs a lot of money for the material, etc. But you also have to know somebody who can help you, because there's no such system. There's not really that much private patronage or people who can support you like that. And I just wanted to say that one thing that Julia Kristeva said about art having a social function. If you understand that artists in Iran have to work within a rigid framework, which has to, abide by the censorship rules set by the government, and we know all about that. And then within that, then they have to kind of work within the context of the sanctions. So they have a very tiny, narrow wiggle room. And in order for them to function on a global platform, how can they do that? Because they don't have the material, and even when it's like even then their expression is controlled. So I just wanted to say that sanctions only result in the increased brain drainage from a country where, if you look at artists are the lungs and the voices of a culture. If you put them against censorship and sanctions, all you're doing is you're silencing and gagging those voices. And what you end up doing is removing chances of democracy from a whole culture.
Well, thank you, Sohaila. Wow.
Eloquence of your speech.
Yes, thank you so much for giving us such a practical as well insight into what it's really like. Daniel McLean is, maybe I'll just say who you are. Art lawyer, probably known to many of you already. He's a specialist of intellectual property law. He works across a wide range of aspects, or ownership, export, very relevant, authenticity of artworks and antiques. He also works drafting, agency, consignment, commissioning, and sale agreements. He's a curator, he's an author, he's written a number of books, and he teaches law at Sotheby's Institute. And he was, this year, nominated one of the lawyers' Hot 100 Lawyers. So
Can you hear me?
Yes, I think so.
Good. Well, that was, thank you for inviting me to participate today. Very, very interesting. Janet, I largely agree with what you say. Your summary was very, very good about the current situation. I mean, in terms of artworks coming out of antiquities coming out of Iraq. There's nothing specific about their export in contrast to Iraq, for example, where there's been specific regulations in place which the UK enacted to try and prevent the pillaging of artifacts coming from Iraq. So artworks and antiquities fall under the normal export regime in theory. It's been quite interesting sort of historically. The English courts there was a very famous case a few years ago in 2007, Iran against Barakat galleries, where the Republic of Iran was able to bring a claim for conversion in principle, that is, a claim to recover objects, very valuable objects which had been unlawfully excavated from its soil. And in that case, the English court upheld the right of the Republic to, in theory, restitute 18 carved jars, bowls, and cups as property which was held sufficiently precisely to belong to Iran under its own national laws within a territory. So it's very interesting in this context to think about actually how potentially Iranian cultural property can actually be protected in the UK, although at the same time, obviously, sanctions have crippled the trade between the UK and Iran, like the other EU countries. Putting it in context, we're all aware of how between 2010 and 2012, the EU, following the US, implemented a large number of sanctions to prohibit trade with Iran, particularly the export of petroleum products from Iran in retaliation for what it perceived to be its nuclear program. So this was an idea of curbing the nuclear program. And towards the end of last year, things cooled a bit, and there were very productive discussions. And early this year, there's an EU Council regulation on 20th of January, which amended some of the main sanctions. Now, it's important to realize that this amendment is only a sort of partial freezing, as it were. It's not a whole reversal. And as Janet said, there's going to be a question very imminently as to whether or not there will be a full-scale reversal of the repeal of the sanctions in force. I think from our point of view, the most relevant aspects of the thaw have been the removal of the prohibition on the export of precious metals and jewellery and so on, things which normally would have prevented their circulation, certainly in the form of antiques, but in other contemporary objects, in jewellery, for example, and also certain changes in relation to financial transactions, because as Janet said, it's all very well being able to lawfully export artworks, contemporary artworks out of Iran, but if financial transactions are caught, which they were and still are, then there's a big problem. You effectively curb the market. So that, as it stands now, transfers equal to 100,000 euros or above still require prior authorization of the competent member state, and transactions over 10,000 euros still require notification of the Treasury. So you're still in a very regulated position where also I think the banks are very skeptical and don't know quite what to do, even if the law has changed. So effectively we have a sort of paralysis of the art market, if I'm right. I mean, it does also seem fascinating as well, seeing how high the results have been in Christie's Dubai for the last year for Iranian artworks at auction. And Parviz Tanavoli is a great example of that. His works have escalated in value incredibly. He's involved, I think, in a dispute in Iran at the moment involving his artworks, which we might want to talk more about, I don't know. But there are lots of imbalances and contradictions going on here. On the one hand, we see how the domestic market can actually be paradoxically fueled by sanctions. Then we can see how the diaspora, very famous artists like Shirat Nishat, all of these artists which have come out of Iran for the last 2 decades are doing spectacularly well. And I suppose the question is how well are your young, struggling artists doing in Iran? So my question goes back to you, ultimately.
I think if you don't come from Tehran and if you don't have somebody, how things work in Iran, from my experiences, if you don't know the right people, you don't have visibility. Everything works on who you know. And so it's functions as you have to have access to Tehran, and you have to have people who have money to help you, to support you. So, I mean, you're talking about the tip of the iceberg, the artists that you see as far as functioning as artists.
And things have got worse or better? Or
from speaking to these artists, I think in the last 5 years it's got worse, but they're just hopeful. They're hopeful because they said to me that since election of Rouhani, that there has been a price freeze on quite a lot of items, goods that they need to buy, like chicken and bread and stuff like that. So they're hopeful because they're thinking that maybe it will get better. I think Iranian on the whole are very hopeful people. I have to say I've never met anyone to be faced with so much negativity and just still be very positive. They really want to function. They want to be a part of the global language. And I think that as far as artists are concerned, they make things happen. They even if they have to get a job and function and collect, get money, they still have their exhibitions, even if they don't sell anything. The joy of being an artist is, at its true, most basic essence of being an artist, works for them. But I don't know what's the percentage of people who actually live on their art. I would say very small.
For those who don't know, could you just tell us a little bit about what happened to Tanavoli, to Parviz Tanavoli, the seizing of his artworks?
I don't know too much about.
I read it. I don't know too much about it. That was one of the questions I had to. Someone would throw some light on it.
Yes, about ownership. I think.
I do. Well, yes. He gave his house. He sold it, but for a limited period, to the Tehran municipality. And they were going to convert the house into a museum. And then it seems that there was a reverse, and the municipality moved in and took away all of his artworks, and it seems they had no control of it. And they are threatening now to sell all of these works because they are not considered to be Islamic. He's a sculptor, Parviz Tanavoli. So perhaps, I don't know who would be best to talk a little bit about these other constraints of being an artist in Iran.
Well, I think one of the issues that was raised, and that regarding Iranian cinema as well, because art and literature, everything is being controlled at a very tight boundaries set by the government. Now that worked really well. As far as I know, the Iranian cinema pre-revolution was very much a Bollywood kind of cinema, and we can see how it's actually improved so much, and it actually is one of the best cinemas. So I think sometimes limitation on expression has kind of helped, because just to quickly say that artists always find another way of talking. Historically, a metaphor.
This is not a film. That was an extraordinary meditation. I've forgotten the film director who was censored, and so he made a film which he said was not a film, which was all about the constraints of censorship. Yes, it's extraordinary.
Just wanted to say that, just quickly to say that artists historically, whether you come from South America or Iran, artists have already or have historically used the language of magic realism and metaphor to speak. That's why in countries that have suffered dictatorship for years and years, throughout their lifetime, even with something like the 1001 Nights, that's written entirely in magic realism, and it's a very political book, and it's written so that it can speak about politics of its time, but in the form of monsters and magic realism. So Iranian artists have always found another way of talking about what they really want to do through metonymy and metaphor. So yes, a lot of the times they can slip through these restrictions through using this historic language.
I'd like to open the floor to questions. Does anybody have any questions for our panelists? Could you wait for the microphone, please?
Yes, good evening. I'm actually the head of the Iran Heritage Foundation, which is based in this building here. First of all, I'd like to pay tribute to artists working now in Iran who, in spite of incredible difficulties, I think, because of the sanctions, are still managing to produce their works and export them, and indeed export themselves with the works sometimes, which is equally difficult. So all credit to you and your colleagues. And the second point I'd like to make is that in spite of the Barakat ruling, and I was actually the advisor to the lawyers acting for the Iranian government, there's still quite a lot of ancient Iranian art being illegally exported. And the sooner that we see an end come to that, the better, I should say.
So it's smuggled out, basically, just smuggled out.
Sorry?
Smuggled out.
Yes, smuggled out illegally, yes.
Sadly. Are there any more questions in the room? I'd like to ask a question. Have the sanctions also impacted on the travel possibilities? Is it much? I've certainly been, I remember Kiarostami's exhibition at the V&A a few years ago. He wasn't able to come because he didn't get his visa. Now, I don't know if that was a problem on the Iranian side or the British side, but is this an issue as well? And have the sanctions impacted on travel as well?
Well, I mean, like one of the things I spoke to the artists was just something that concerns all Iranians. If you want to get a domestic flight in Iran, you really are worried about whether your plane is going to land. I think that's a real concern. And I think, like I said, Iranians are very positive people. They just get on a plane and hope for the best. But I mean, if that's something, a part of your business trip every day, or something that you really have to, feature into your life, that's quite something. And I think that also roads have got slightly better, but they're still quite dangerous to travel. And I think when I talk about sanctions against engine parts, it could be for an airplane, it could be for a car, and Iranians on the whole tend to have Iranian-made cars. And so, I mean, in a way, there's been a massive boom as far as, supporting the internal industry. And of course, that happens with any country that has got sanctions against it. So, yes, they have old Russian aeroplane parts, Aeroflot, and old Aeroflot planes. And I think that's, it's worrying because these planes are over 35 years old. And I think they're not efficient fuel-wise, and therefore they're not very cheap. So I think you've got to think about, how to lift these sanctions will actually improve the life of people in Iran. And of course, the international flights are okay, as far as I know, but they're extremely expensive. I mean, if you're talking about somebody's income being £200 a month, you're talking about a flight costing like 70 or 80 pounds. So it's just not possible to fly.
And it does affect the flights because some of the airlines are not able then to fuel, or certainly Iran Air is not able to fuel here, so it has to go, I think, to Germany to fuel and then go back to Iran. So yes, and because we still don't have the full diplomatic relations with Iran, there is no British embassy in Tehran, and there's no full operating, there is a consulate of Iran in London, but it's not a fully operating one. So yes, it does make it very difficult to get the visas.
So how do you, if you were an Iranian artist and you want to travel abroad, where do you go for your visa?
Either go to Turkey, you have to go, but the visa process is very long, and they'll take your passport from you. They do apparently give you a piece of paper which enables you to then travel back to Iran, and then when the passport is ready, they'll call you back again. But it's very hit and miss. They may not allow you to travel on that piece of paper.
And would the lifting of sanctions change that that administrative?
Yes, the full diplomatic relations are installed
would be part of it.
Yes. So yes. I mean, they're very positive. We had a talk from Jack Straw. He was very, very positive about the situation. Good. So we all hope that it is going to improve.
So I'm going to be able to take one more question at the back of the room. Marta.
I wanted to ask about the Timoka, the collection of the Museum of Contemporary Art in Tehran, which is basically in a limbo because it's a collection of contemporary art of the likes of Warhol, and it doesn't obviously go in the line with the current, politics, so it's not displayed, it cannot be, I don't know, I wanted to find out if it's actually allowed to leave the country, to travel and be exhibited elsewhere. What is the legal status of this collection?
That's a very good question.
That's a very good question.
You're going to answer it?
I can't answer.
There's two, well, I don't know about the legalities behind it, but there's two instances where TMOCA have lent part of their collection, which, as you say, they can't show, although they are looking after it. One, I think they both were actually in Basel. They lent a Calder work and a Bacon, major works. And it all went perfectly fine, very smoothly, and then the works went back to Iran, so that wasn't a problem. There was a period in 2004, during Hatami's time, when the situation was opening up, and I think there were negotiations at that point to do many more travelling exhibitions. The British Council were in touch with the director of TMOCA. They did do a British Council exhibition of British art in Tehran, and vice versa. They were going to take an exhibition of Iranian art from the collection to the UK, but that never actually happened. But there are now negotiations with the British Council, so perhaps things will start to move again. But it's quite a positive situation.
It's quite interesting if you bring things here, of course, because I suppose the immunity from seizure legislation would have to come into play, because there are a lot of wealthy, dispossessed Iranians in London who I know personally are dying to get their artworks back from the museums in Tehran.
But not that museum, because that was Farah Diba who put together that collection, so that has been nationalised. But
case when they did a swap of one of the works.
Case, of course, was with the Shahnameh, with
yes,
Oliver
and
Hall,
the de Kooning.
yes, and the de Kooning.
Yes.
But it hasn't happened again, has it?
No. Whether they're talking about it or not, I don't know. But I think they've realised the value. You know, they've realised that their Shahnameh is still only worth $1 million, whereas the de Kooning, which they swapped it for parity, $1 million, was sold maybe 3 or 4 years ago for $84 million.
Yes.
So, you know, they've realised that they do have a very valuable collection there. So.
Maybe we can take the last question, if there is a last question. Okay, well, in that case, I'm going to thank our speakers so much for coming, for being here, and for giving us such a wonderful talk.
Thank you so much, and thank you, Georgina, for moderating all those varied discussions. I mean, going from Japan to China to Iran, it's quite a lot to do in 2 hours, so really, really amazing. Vastari would like to welcome you to some refreshments and a few nibbles so that you can get to know each other and ask any questions that perhaps you might still have. And thank you very much for coming.